It's really great to be here. To be honest, I'm a bit anxious about this talk as well because this is about energy and climate, and I know almost nothing about energy and climate. But then the organization managed to convince me that I actually do know something about it, or that at least my ideas are in a way connected to the challenge that we're facing right now. So to give you a little bit of background, I was born in 1988. So that was 1 year before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, I don't mean to imply that's causally connected, but what is important here is that I'm part of a generation that was brought up with the idea that, basically we had arrived at the end of history, right? You probably all know this famous essay by the American philosopher Francis Fukuyama, who wrote that we had arrived at the end of history, we just had reached the finish line. It was only a matter of time before everyone in the world would become democratic, prosperous, and would embrace capitalism. That was the 90s. If you read the original essay by Fukuyama, he mentions that there are still a couple of things that we need to worry about, like what's the next iPhone, what's it going to look like, or environmental issues, but that's about it. Oh yeah, sure. I'm wired up, so is this the one?
Yeah, here we go.
Is this better? Should I start over? Oh, it wasn't important what I was saying up until now. Anyway, the idea was that we had arrived at the end of history, right? And then this thing happened in 2008, the financial crash, and now we've seen obviously all these things like Brexit and the rise of Donald Trump, or someone like Bolsonaro in Brazil. And for many people around the globe, it's now obviously clear that we were maybe a bit too optimistic, and history seems to have rebooted once again. One thing that I always have believed is that we need to think a little bit more boldly. When I was studying history at Utrecht, I'm from Holland, so I was studying history in Utrecht University. Many of my history professors told me that utopian thinking is quite dangerous, right? We've seen many examples of that. If you look at the 20th century, fascism, communism. The idea among many intellectuals was that as soon as you start thinking in utopian terms, there are dangerous things. You may come up with some kind of blueprint, and then if people don't agree with you, well, then there's always the temptation to chop their head off. So the whole thing of utopian thinking had gained quite a bad reputation, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and especially after the complete failure of communism. But I started actually to believe that we had thrown away the child with the bathwater, that we need some kind of vision for the future. To give you a couple of examples, what have we seen in the past couple of years? Well, we've seen, for example, the way that someone like Hillary Clinton tried to win the presidency and then failed. At one point, she gave an interview with New York Magazine where she said, what was I'm the last thing standing between you and the apocalypse. Now, I don't think that's a great slogan. I'm not the apocalypse. Then, meanwhile, I was reading a lot of interesting articles by people on the left, but the thing I noticed that people on the left mainly know what they're against, right? So they're against austerity, against racism, against homophobia, against the establishment, against climate change, against growth, basically against everything. I even found out there was actually a book published with the title Against Everything by a famous leftist New York intellectual. But then the thing is, you also need to know what you're actually for, right? Where you want to go next. I always like to point out that Martin Luther King never said, I have a nightmare, right? He had a dream. He had some kind of idea, some vision of where he wanted to go. But wherever I looked, in politics or in academia, there were very few people who were actually willing to sketch some kind of scenario of a future society that was just a way better place to live than the societies that we're living in right now. And I think this is exactly what's happening often when we talk about climate change as well. The language that we use is often about, you know, avoiding catastrophe. That's mainly what it's about. You've got this whole degrowth movement, like we need to crack down on consumerism, we need to consume less, oh, we're such parasites on this planet, we're doing such horrible things, blah, 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 blah. And that may all be true, but it's not very motivating, isn't it? So take, for example, the whole idea of degrowth. I think that growth is a beautiful word, isn't it? I mean, kids grow, plants grow. So I think you shouldn't be against growth. We just gotta redefine what it is. We just gotta take this language of progress and of efficiency and of innovation and to give different definitions to it. Another example is consumerism. So consumerism, you know, this thing where you keep on buying stuff you don't need to impress people you don't really like. We can also redefine that, actually. What if we consume more of our wealth in a completely different way? And for example, you know, move towards a much shorter working week. Why don't we talk about that? So this is, I think, what I could bring to the discussion. Often when we talk about things like energy and climate change, we focus on the technical and the technological solutions. You know, there are brilliant scientists coming up with new ideas, I mean, about solar energy or whatever. Then there are smart economists who say, oh, we could implement a carbon tax or whatever. But there's another part that we need as well, which is some kind of vision of a society that's actually just a better place to live, you know, that catches people's imagination and makes them hopeful for the future. A couple of weeks ago, as you may know, I was in Davos at the World Economic Forum. And you know, I said something that I've been saying for a very long time, which is that, well, maybe the rich just need to stop avoiding their taxes and start paying them. Somehow, I don't know, somehow this time I actually, some people listened to that. But what happened as well is that on that Tuesday, I was in a panel that was not accessible for journalists. It was a private panel under Chatham House rules, so I'm not allowed to quote anyone literally. But at some point during the conversation, we were talking about what was happening in France. And there was a French CEO who stood up and said, what you guys don't understand is that what happened here is that, okay, so there was a fuel tax implemented, and people became really angry because of that. But what also happened is that Macron, the president, you know, I think you could argue he's a quite technocratic, some would say elitist president, he also abolished the wealth tax, and people never forgave him for that. So if we come up with all kinds of different solutions, we also got to make sure that, you know, the broader population is actually enthusiastic about it. So that's why I think that all of these issues are interconnected. You can't talk about climate change or energy without talking about inequality or poverty or the meaning of work and all of these things at the same time. Let me focus on maybe one of the most hopeful ideas we have here, which is the idea of a much shorter working week, because that will possibly help us the most in addressing climate change. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at history, for decades, I think this goes actually back to the 1920s and the 1930s, almost all of the economists and sociologists and philosophers, they all believed that we would be working less and less and less and less, right? Because the robots were coming, they were going to do all the work, and in the future, the real challenge was supposed to be boredom, right? So there's a wonderful essay that was published in the 50s by science fiction author Isaac Asimov. He wrote it for the New York Times. And he was asked to predict the future, right? Look ahead in the future 50 years in time. He made a lot of interesting predictions. But the one thing he was really sure about was, you know, we're going to work a lot less. Boredom is going to be the greatest challenge. And therefore, the biggest profession of the future will be psychiatry and you know, psychology. Because people are suffering from all these symptoms of boredom, like, oh, what am I going to do with my life? Yeah, they're really going to suffer from that, and they need help. So that's what Isaac Asimov predicted. If you look what's been happening since then, especially since the 1980s, it's both true and not true at the same time. So indeed, psychiatry has become a huge profession, but it's mainly treating people from the opposite, people who are suffering from stress and burnout. So something has gone completely wrong here. The original promise of capitalism was that we would work less and less and less, so that we could live the good life, and that we would, consume our wealth in the form of leisure, very different kind of consumerism. But what has actually happened, especially since the 1980s in Western countries, is that we keep on buying stuff we don't need. So that's one of the questions I became really, really interested in. How did this happen? Is this inevitable? Could it have gone any other way? And I quickly discovered actually that the most common explanation for this whole phenomenon, again, is consumerism, right? Somehow there's this whole industry right now of marketing that has become so sophisticated that is able to convince us to buy all this stuff that we don't really need. And for a long time I was actually convinced by that explanation. But it all changed on a day when I read a really interesting paper by an American anthropologist, and I really recommend that you read it as well. It's called On the Phenomenon of, and here comes a very scientific term, bullshit jobs. So what David Graeber does in that article, he also asks the question like, what happened to that original promise of capitalism? Why are we still sitting in all these prisons that we call offices? Why are we still sending emails to people we don't like? Why do we have all these stupid meetings? And am I looking at another useless PowerPoint presentation? What happened, right? And he also considers the answer, well, maybe it's consumerism, but that's not really likely, is it? Because most of the stuff we consume is produced in third world countries. All that plastic nonsense that we have, we don't produce it ourselves. In countries like Norway or Holland, where I'm from, the vast majority of people work in the service sector, right? They're all sitting in these offices, sending these emails, writing reports no one's ever going to read. So something different must have happened. And here's where we should start thinking about what work actually is. David Graeber came up with this interesting concept of a bullshit job, but there's two Dutch economists who came out with a really interesting paper. They call it socially useless jobs. Maybe I should use that term instead. And what they did is they asked people the question, do you think your job adds anything of value to society? Does your job have any meaning? So it's not up to me or up to you to talk about other people like, oh, your job is meaningless. I'm a historian, maybe you think, that's the definition of useless. Doesn't work like that, I'm sorry. What you do is you ask people themselves, what do you think about your own job? These two Dutch economists had a representative, how do you call it? A group of like 30,000 people, of employees in more than 40 countries, who were all asked this question, does your job add anything of meaning to society? Turns out that actually 25% is not sure. 25% is sort of, maybe it doesn't really matter if I don't show up at work, We'll not become any richer or less interesting or whatever. Now, there's an appendix to that paper as well, so you can look at who are these people? Well, I can tell you one thing, they're not teachers. They're not nurses, care workers, firefighters, police officers, etc. You should really think about people who work in finance. Scores very high. Economists actually are like in the top. Marketing, like all the usual suspects are there. What's also interesting is that there are 4 times as many socially meaningless jobs in the private sector as in the public sector. So this turns the whole usual narrative about the wasteful public sector and the entrepreneurial private sector on its head. There are way more people in the private sector who doubt the value and the meaning of their job than in the public sector. So that's interesting to think about. At one point I thought, okay, what's another way to measure this? And I thought, well, we could just do an experiment, right? People could just stop doing their work and then see what happens. See if people start complaining, right? This is what we usually call a strike. People go on strike, and then sometimes people complain, sometimes they don't. I thought, wouldn't it be great if all telemarketeers would go on strike? I mean, that'd be wonderful. Has never happened, sadly, in history. But, we have seen many examples of, for example, garbage collectors going on strike. It's a disaster every time, I can assure you. In my book, I give this example of a strike of garbage collectors in New York in 1968. It lasted for about a week until the state of emergency had to be declared. The military had to come in, and usually the garbage collectors win because we really can't do without them. We really depend on them. At that point I wondered, has it ever happened, throughout history, in the past, let's say 5,000 years since the invention of money, that the bankers went on strike? Has it ever happened? That'd be really interesting to see. Turns out, there's actually one example. Maybe there are more, but this is the only example that I could find after months of research. And this was in Ireland in 1970. The Irish bankers were angry that their wages were not keeping up with inflation. So they said, you know what, you'll have it, we're going to go on strike. And then you'll see just how important we are. Most experts at that point, most economists predicted disaster. I mean, this was supposed to be like a heart attack for the economy. What are we going to do without our bankers, right? Businesses can't operate anymore. The growth rate will plummet, etc., etc. But the bankers were, they were really angry. They wanted higher wages, and they said, we're really going to stop. So from one day till the other day, 85% of the money supply in Irish was suddenly not accessible anymore. People just couldn't access their accounts. So it started. Now this strike lasted for 6 months. And nothing much happened, actually. The businesses just kept operating, the Irish economy just kept growing. And even the Bank of Ireland said, well, we don't see much signs that actually anything has happened. If you look at the statistics, it's has been a normal year for us. It's really interesting to think about what was actually going on. So what the Irish did is they basically developed their own money system, right, from the bottom up. Ireland at that moment had 15,000 pubs, and what people started doing is they started writing IOUs on, let's say, toilet paper or the backs of cigar boxes, and the pub owners became the new bankers. So they said, sure, you can be trusted, I believe you've got the money, and they became sort of, I don't know, how do you call that? The brokers of the whole system. There's one historian who later wrote, if you sell liquids to people, you also know something about the liquidity of your clients. So these are like the perfect new bankers. And the system worked quite well. And then after 6 months, the bankers came back and said, all right, we'll get back to work. So that strike didn't work out very well for them. I think that these kind of stories make us rethink what the value of work actually is, right? So we can't do without the financial sector. I mean, the Irish immediately came up with something, invented a new system of money, so we can't do without it. But maybe there's a lot of what we call work today that is not very meaningful, that is actually wasteful in many ways, and is also not good for the planet, that only fuels our consumerism, and maybe that we could do that differently. So if you compare countries around the globe, and if you look at the countries with the shortest paid working weeks, you also see that they have the smallest environmental footprint. It's quite interesting. So what I believe we could do is we could move and transition towards a society where we'll just use our wealth in a different way. We'll use it in a way that will do less paid work, especially that kind of wasteful paid work that people don't find meaningful at all. And we'll do more unpaid work that is currently not, we don't count it in things like GDP, for example, but it is incredibly important, like caring for our children, volunteers work, you name it. That is sort of what we should do. More than just being against something, against growth, against, I don't know, the GDP, blah, blah, blah. We should come up with alternatives, different ways of talking about this, different ways of measuring things. And that's why I'm so excited about this, this whole concept of socially useless jobs, because I've gone into many debates actually with economists about this, and they usually have no idea what to say, because this data is completely new. It's just the first time that someone thought, well, maybe we should just ask people, do they actually think that their job is useful, yes or no? No one had come up with that idea before, and it turns out that a lot of people actually don't think their job is very useful. Now, there's one other idea that is really connected to this, and that I've written quite a bit about, and that you may have heard of. Just 5-6 years ago, it was completely forgotten, and now I was actually invited to Davos to talk about it. Well, I didn't talk about it, I decided to give my speech about taxes instead, but it doesn't matter. This idea became extraordinarily popular in the past couple of years, and it's called universal basic income. Now, who hasn't heard about the idea of giving everyone a basic income? Now, that's really interesting, because if I would have asked this question 5 years ago, probably all of your hands would have gone up in the air. It's, I think, a good example of, you know, how ideas can start changing the world. You know, it almost never starts in the center. You know, with the mainstream politicians and journalists. It almost always starts on the fringes, with people who are first dismissed as crazy and ridiculous and unrealistic, and then it starts moving towards the center. That's often what happens. Now, this idea of giving everyone a basic income is quite an old idea, actually. It goes back to, well, the 18th century probably. Thomas Paine, the American founding father, already wrote about it. And there are all sorts of reasons why we may be interested in it. You know, in the short term, I believe it's the most efficient, most effective way to completely eradicate poverty. There's a huge amount of evidence, you know, from randomized controlled trials. You know, you've now got a lot of programs, especially in the global south, in Mexico, and Brazil, and South Africa, you name it, where they're just giving money to the poor, basically. And it turns out that the real experts on the poor's lives are the poor themselves, and not, you know, us sitting in our offices writing reports. So that's sort of the short-term reason. But the long-term reason is, I believe, that it could be a tool to really transform our society and move it in that different direction that I was talking about. Why? Well, for example, let's imagine you're 17, 18 years old and you know that you'll have a basic income in the future. Many of us had this conversation when we were 17 or 18 years old with maybe our parents, and we wanted to study literature or the arts or whatever. And then the old people came up to us and said, oh, that's really interesting, but you got to earn a living, right? Maybe just postpone that. There will be time for that in the future. Start studying, I don't know, business, organization, finance, blah, blah first, and then we'll talk about all your dreams later. So that happens a lot, right? People do that for 20 years, then they have a midlife crisis, and then they finally start painting what they, you know, have wanted to do all their lives. I've always found that interesting, right? You've got these interviews in magazines, you know, or sometimes with a CEO who has said, I quit my job, and I'm gonna paint. And in these lifestyle magazines, it's always portrayed as a heroic decision. He's actually doing what he wants to do. Oh, it's so impressive. What kind of society is this, where it's heroic to do what you want to do? I mean, I'd want to move towards a society where everyone immediately makes a decision, and I think a basic income would help. Because then you can always fall back on that, and you don't need to worry about the floor that could fall underneath you. The other thing that could happen is really connected to the idea of these strikes of garbage collectors and of bankers and what happened in these cases. So if you give a basic income to everyone, people in the lower classes or in the lower middle classes will have much more bargaining power. They can always say, you know what, I'll just stop working. And I can always fall back on my basic income. So it would function as a universal strike fund. Now, standard economics tells us that then if you give more bargaining power to people, they can bargain for higher wages. So in the long run, in a basic income society, the wages will much better reflect the social value of the jobs that we do. So therefore, I think that it's more than just another technocratic tool. It's really a way to transition to a completely different society. Now, how is this connected to energy and climate change? In many ways, in the first place, it's all about living different kind of lives. But there's also now one very interesting idea out there that has bipartisan support. I'm not sure if you know, but Hillary Clinton gave an interview a couple of months after the election that she lost. It was with Vox.com, and it was a long interview where she talked about all the ideas that they didn't try. And one of the ideas was actually basic income, but a very particular version of it. Clinton called it Alaska for America. Now, you should know that Alaska has a policy since the 1970s that they've got all this oil in the ground there, and unlike in Texas, the politicians in Alaska said, okay, this oil is everyone's property, right? Just like in Norway. And we got to share the benefits of it. Now, what they did is they created a fund, the Alaska Permanent Fund, and since the 1980s, people have been receiving a dividend out of that every year. It's about sometimes $3,000 a year, and it makes a real substantial difference. If you're a family of 4, you get let's say $8,000. It pulls a lot of people out of poverty, and it's one of the reasons why Alaska is the state with the lowest inequality of all the 50 states in the US. Why is this interesting? I mentioned that it has bipartisan support. I think it's an idea that moves beyond traditional left-wing, right-wing thinking, because the left may like it because it's about doing something about inequality, doing something about poverty, but the right may like it because it's about shrinking the size of the paternalistic state. Right? People get the freedom to decide for themselves what they want to do in this money. And it's a state or a society where everyone is a stakeholder. Everyone gets a dividend each year. Now, the depressing thing here is, of course, that this is funded by oil money, right? So it's dirty money. But then what is so exciting about this? Well, the exciting thing is that what we could do is implement some kind of CO2 tax, which is like the darling of the economist, right? All the economists say the CO2 tax is like the best thing we have, a carbon tax. That's what we should do. But how do you sell it to the public? I mean, we've seen in France that it can be really difficult. Well, what if we would just say the air is everyone's property, right? The air is our common, we own it together. And if you put carbon in the air, then you should pay a price for that. Sounds very reasonable, right? And then if you would have that tax, you would get in a lot of money, and you could actually fund a basic income with that. There are now actually quite a few conservatives in the US who are arguing for this idea of a tax and dividend proposal. It's one of the most exciting ideas out there right now. As I mentioned, it has bipartisan support. The whole philosophy behind it goes back till the 18th century. It's really about we share this earth together, and we should all, get a share of that. And it's also one of the most efficient and most effective ways to do something about this whole climate crisis. These are just a couple of ideas. What I really wanted to bring home here, or really wanted to make the point, is when we talk about all these issues, we also got to think about that we need to sketch some kind of future society that is actually a better place to live. Not just the current society that is a bit less, say, carbon intensive and has a smaller environmental footprint. I mean, that would be great. But it would be much greater if it would also be a radically better place to live. Is this realistic? Is this reasonable? Well, I think that, as I said during quite a few interviews in the past couple of years, just 10 years ago, it would have been unimaginable for a historian like me to go viral with a speech about taxes, taxes, taxes. Just 5 years ago, it would have been unimaginable that this idea of basic income would gain a lot of traction. I mean, just 10 years ago, if you talk about the urgency of climate change, I think that more and more people around the globe realize that it's a huge issue. And for a historian, 10 years is nothing. So for me, the pace of the change is really incredible. So I'm quite hopeful for the future. But just remember that change doesn't come from the people who always stay reasonable and are looking for the politically sensible solutions. Sometimes what we need to do first is to be a bit unreasonable and to try and expand the definition of what is actually possible. Thank you.